The next step to eliminate a belief is to figure out when you formed it. Most of our beliefs, certainly this belief and most of the other ones on this program, were formed from events that occurred when you were a very young child. A belief doesn't come from a single incident, but from many similar interactions. And when it's a very broad belief like mistakes and failure are bad, or a belief about oneself like I'm not good enough, it's always formed from experiences we've had with our parents. This is not to play the blame game with your parents. Most likely they did their best to bring you up as well as they could. Most parents love their children. But how many are aware that children are forming these kinds of beliefs as they grow up? I think you know the answer to that one. After all, what parenting university did your parents go to? Probably the same one my parents went to. As a result, most parents just don't realize the impact of their words and behavior on their children. And that's why most of us form negative beliefs from our interactions with our parents, even though that's not what they intended at all. You see, there's a constant conflict between what most parents want and what most children do. Parents usually want their kids to be quiet. Kids are not usually quiet. Parents usually want their kids to be neat. Young children don't even understand the concept of neat. Parents usually want their kids to do what they're told. Kids usually want to do what they want to do. When kids don't follow instructions, the reaction of their parents ranges from mild annoyance to extreme anger and punishment. Now, take a look at your early life and see where the belief, mistakes and failure are bad, comes from. For some people, finding the source of a belief can be difficult. But I found that the following story makes it easier if you just listen and observe the memories that come up for you. Derek, who wanted to stop believing mistakes and failure are bad, had a hard time finding out what led him to form this belief early in his life. He could easily remember examples from recent experience, but after examination he could tell that he must already have believed mistakes and failure are bad in order to worry about making mistakes today. It was also easier for him to remember experiences in elementary school because they were so painful. He had some mean teachers. Yet when he looked more closely, he realized that he already had some negative perceptions about making mistakes before he got to school. He had to conclude that the events occurred before he set foot in school, but he could hardly remember what happened at home with his parents until he heard about Jessica's experiences growing up. You see, when Jessica was a child, she did ordinary things that most children do and that most parents find upsetting. Sometimes she spilled things, and her parents would frown at her and tell her to be more careful next time, with a slight edge to their voices. Sometimes she left things out which later were ruined, and her parents would ask her, "When are you going to learn to put things away?" Sometimes she would forget to do things her parents asked, or forget to refrain from doing something she was told not to do. And they said, "How many times do I have to tell you, can't you ever do things right?" Once Jessica recalled these experiences, she knew what had led her to conclude mistakes and failure are bad. When Derek heard about Jessica's experiences, he began to remember how his parents reacted to him when he didn't behave the way they wanted him to. His experiences were very different than Jessica's. His parents' disapproval was far more subtle. In fact, his parents were very kind most of the time, but they still expressed disapproval at some of his behavior, and it's those times that led Derek to form his belief. In fact, Derek also realized that he didn't even need to remember what he was doing that got his parents upset. He only needed to know how they reacted when they didn't like his behavior. So look inside to find out how your parents reacted when you didn't do what they wanted, when they wanted, or the way they wanted. It's okay if one experience comes to mind. It's also okay if 100 experiences come to mind. What's important is that you know that no one event led to the belief. In fact, in most cases, a belief is formed from many similar experiences. So even if you remember only one event, it's just an example of the way your parents usually reacted when they didn't like your behavior. It's important to keep this in mind as you proceed through the remaining steps of this process. Now, you may not have experienced the exact situations I just described in your childhood, but I bet you probably did experience something like them. In some families, the disapproval and criticism is subtle, and in others, very obvious. But it's almost always there. Even if you're unable to remember specific events, the process will work if you have a sense that similar events occurred when you were a child, and you can visualize the way your parents would have looked and or sounded as they responded to you. Remember, the purpose of this step in the process is not to make your parents wrong. Even if you had a wonderful childhood and had great parents, very few of them are able to keep from getting annoyed with the behavior of their young children. And if you can't remember your childhood, don't worry. There's a way to complete this step even if you have no early memories. I can't remember anything before the age of 6 and very little before the age of 9. And I've eliminated several hundred beliefs and have had several major changes in my life. To begin with, you don't need to remember specific incidents. As long as you have a sense that one or both of your parents got annoyed or angry when you didn't do what they wanted, when they wanted, the way they wanted, and you can imagine what that would have been like, that's all that's necessary. Here's another way to find the source of the belief. Recall whatever you can of your relationship with your parents when you were a bit older. Maybe when you were in elementary school, junior high, or even high school. How did your parents react when you didn't do what they wanted, or didn't do things the way they wanted you to do then? How did your parents deal with a younger brother or sister? This will make it a little bit more real how they probably treated you when you were a small child. When you imagine how they responded to you, doesn't it seem like you could see mistakes and failure are bad in those events? If so, you found the source of the belief. I don't mean you were consciously thinking this at the time. Most of the time when we conclude something, we don't say it out loud or even internally. But often in hindsight, it's clear that we did in fact conclude something about what was happening. Please pause the video while the memories continue to come to mind and spend a moment remembering how your parents reacted when you didn't do what they wanted, when they wanted, or the way they wanted. Okay? Now you've imagined some examples of childhood events that could have led to the belief mistakes and failure are bad. When I stop speaking, write down the type of situation, the events, that anyone who might have been there would have seen. Describe them such as, my dad usually shouted at me when I made a mistake, or Mom frequently got annoyed at me when I didn't do things exactly the way she wanted. Take the time you need because this is important. When you're done writing, click Continue below to continue the process to eliminate this belief.